All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another lecture in medical terminology. I hope that you're dancing along with me because this is the last chapter to go along in terms of what I call the core chapters, chapters 1, 2, 3, and 4. If you understand chapters 1 through 4 very well, then you're on way toward the best chance of succeeding throughout the rest of the chapters and hopefully throughout the rest of the course. Well, let's go ahead and get started and finish up this chapter. All right, here are some of the goals that we hope to accomplish by the end of Chapter 4. Define basic prefixes used in the medical language. Analyze medical terms that combine prefixes and other word elements. Learn about the Rh condition as an example of an antigen-antibody reaction. I'm not going to go through all of these combining forms, but I'll go ahead and highlight some that I would recommend that you would want to know. For example, you want to know carpo, which means wrist bones. For example, carpal means pertaining to the wrist bones. Scisso, which means to cut, for example, very similar to scissors, the scissors that you use to cut paper or you cut whatever. Here's a confusing one, costo. Costo means rib. For example, intercostal muscles means pertaining to in between the ribs or pertaining to the muscles in between the ribs. But don't confuse this one with Costco, which is that big warehouse that sells a lot of the goodies and foods and all that stuff there. You don't want to confuse it with that one. So be sure to not do that. Cutaneo here means skin. For example, subcutaneous means beneath the skin. We have ducto, which means to lead, to carry. For example, it's not a medical term, but aqueduct, okay, which is a particular kind of passageway or pathway that water takes to transport itself from one place to another. Another one here is flexo, which means to bend. For example, the process of taking two structures and bending them closer toward each other is known as flexion, which we'll learn a little bit later in the class, a little bit in other lectures, I mean. Flex is the shorthand for flexion, just to let you guys know. And also we have glosso, which means tongue. Another word here, a combining form, I mean, glyco means sugar. For example, we have glycogen. And glycogen is a particular kind of compound, more specifically a carbohydrate, a polysaccharide containing lots and lots of glucose molecules all chained together in this massive, again, massive long chain. That would be an example of glycogen. Our bodies, whenever we have a little bit too much sugar or just too much sugar in general, will store the excess sugar in the form of glycogen, not starch. Be very careful with that one. Plants are the organisms that store their excess sugar in the form of starch. For example, potatoes, which is a plant obviously, and many other kinds of plant species will store their excess sugar in the form of starch. We, glycogen. Immuno here means protection. Morpho here means shape or form. Morto means death. For example, what is the mortality rate in this city due to the disease that is caused on the city? So that is an example of using that there. Or if you're trying to find a way to remember what morto means, think of the Addams family. Who was Mr. Adams' wife? It's Morticia. Morto, death. Morticia. I think you can see the connection going on here. So hopefully that will help you out. Nati means birth. For example, neonate pertaining to newborns. We also have here normo, which means rule and order. Oxo means oxygen. And pubo means pubis, which is the anterior portion of the pelvic or the hip bone, not to be confused with pubic, okay, or puberty, okay, that don't confuse that. Another one here is sepso, which means infection. For example, if a bacteria were able to colonize inside in the bloodstream, which is very difficult to do, number one, Main reason why is because the bloodstream is constantly pumping blood. It's constantly moving, so it's very difficult for bacteria in the bloodstream to find a foothold or to anchor itself down somewhere and cause an infection. That's one of the reasons why, if you had to choose between swimming in a pond or a river, it's better to swim in a river because the water is constantly moving. Bacteria cells have a very difficult time anchoring themselves in moving water or moving liquids or substances versus that in still water. So just to let you guys know that. Somno here means sleep. For example, insomnia. Hopefully, no one in the class is going to get insomnia, which is a condition of lack of sleep. Okay, I hope that you guys are getting adequate amount of sleep. The recommendation here is 8 hours a day. Although I do have my experiences in college, and I understand that sometimes sleep is very hard to come by, especially if you are studying and working and trying to support yourself all at the same time. That one for sure. We also have here thyro, which means thyroid gland or a shield. We have topo, which means a place, position, or a location. And of course, the most obvious one here is toxo, which is a type of poison. For example, toxic. A substance is considered to be toxic means pertaining to being a poison or poison-like. Okay. We have trachea, which means windpipe or trachea, and of course we have here urethra, which means urethra. Just keep this in mind that we have here the urinary system. I'm going to draw here two kidneys. This pathway here would be known as the ureter. And then we have here the urinary bladder, and then we have the pathway here. This is the urethra. All right? These two here would be known as ureters. And just to kind of give you a preview, urethra here and ureters are often confused in medical terminology. Tons of students are confuse these two. So one of the best ways that I would recommend trying to distinguish between these two structures is that ureter here has two E's in its word. That means that the ureter, and of course we have two ureters, one here that goes from our left kidney down to the bladder, and another one that goes from our right kidney down to the bladder. So just keep that in mind. There are two E's, so that's probably those pipes over there. And then we have one E in urethra, which pertains to the bladder, the pathway or the tube that connects between the bladder and the outside world. So something to help you remember those two, and hopefully that will serve you some justice or maybe even result in some points on an exam. Some additional suffixes here. For example, a blast is embryonic or immature. For example, osteoblasts are bone cells that are pretty much stem cell-like, embryonic, immature. These are the types of cells that build bones. Let me write that here, osteo. Oops. Sorry about that, guys. My pen is acting up on me. Osteoblast. We also have crine, which means to secrete. For example, endocrine gland. For example, your pancreas is an example of an endocrine gland. We also have exocrine glands, like our sweat glands, sebaceous glands, or exocrine glands. They secrete hormones or substances outside of the body. Endocrine glands secrete them inside the body. Fusion means coming together or to pour. Gen, we definitely know what this means. Substance that produces. We also have lapse, which is to slide, fall, or to sag. We also have lysis, which means breakdown, destruction, or separation. For example, we have glycolysis, which means the breakdown, the breakdown of glucose, but not the destruction, okay? It's breaking down. We also have here dialysis. Dialysis means the separation of nitrogenous waste away from a particular structure. In this case, dialysis is most commonly referred to separation of nitrogenous waste from the bloodstream. Your kidneys are your natural organs that help in the process of urodialysis. We have a meter, which means to measure. No, not a parking meter, although so many, I'm pretty sure there are a number of students out there that can't find parking on the first day of class and have to use one of those parking spots that contain a parking meter. For example, a thermometer, not particularly a medical term, but a good application of it. A thermometer is an instrument used to measure the kinetic energy of molecules or the amount of heat. For example, water boils at 100 degrees Celsius. How do we know that? You can use a thermometer, and when the water boils, it will tell you what temperature it boils at. A mission mission here means to send. For example, missionary is someone who goes on, who is sent out to spread a belief or something like that. And or here means one who. So some examples of those there. Additional suffixes here. For example, partum means birth or labor. Prepartum and postpartum. Prepartum is a condition when a pregnant mother is prior to giving birth, and postpartum is after. Actually, more specific, not prepartum, but antepartum. Antepartum, sorry, here. Antepartum means before birth, and postpartum means after birth or labor. We also have phoria, which means to bear, carry, or feeling. We have pnea, which means breathing. For example, apnea is a term you might come across. Apnea means a condition of not breathing. We also have rhea, which means flow or discharge. We definitely know what this one is, diarrhea. Okay, I don't need to explain too much about diarrhea, but we definitely know this means a complete discharge of feces or fecal matter from the rectum. We also have here trophy, which means development or nourishment, not to be confused with a trophy that you win from a competition. So don't confuse those. Let's go ahead and begin the first lesson here, talking about some of the prefixes that you might encounter in medical terminology. A most common one that you're going to see is a or an, which means no, not, or without. Once again, even though the definition of these prefixes, suffixes, or word parts might have more than one definition, but keep in mind that depending on how it's used in the field, it could be one of the three definitions, but not necessarily all three. It's up to you to go into the glossary, and whenever you see a medical term, go and define it, and then go back and see how which one of those three meanings for these prefixes are used. Again, the meanings of prefixes, suffixes, and roots are only clue words that help you derive the true definition of these medical terms, but not the actual definition of self. Once again, if you've heard my previous lectures, you can't slap these definitions together and call it that's the definition of that word. For example, apnea, I just talked about this one. Apnea means not breathing. And then we also have another one here, anoxia. Anoxia means condition of no oxygen. Once again, I mentioned here earlier ante, which means before or forward, and we definitely know antepartum means before birth. Oh, I'm sorry, let's go back here. We also have ad and ab. Ab here means away from, and ad here means toward. For example, abduction. Abduction means when you're moving away from the midline. And I like to think of abduction, as horrible as it may sound, it's like abducting a child. Okay, it sounds very bad, but it helps you remember, helps a lot of people remember what ab means. Abduction means away from the midline. So if you can see here, my hand is going from the center of my face and then away from the midline. That would be abduction. And then we have here when my hand is going toward the center or my midline, that is adduction. A-D-D, adduction. Ana here means up or apart. For example, you might hear the word anabolism. And we definitely remember the word anabolism, sorry, anabolism from a previous chapter. Anabolism is a chemical process that is part of metabolism that allows for molecules, that describes molecules being built, larger molecules being built from smaller building blocks. For example, whenever a protein's being made, you take amino acids and they combine together and they form this bond. And any of you guys might know what this bond, some of you guys might know what this bond is. It is a peptide bond. Those two amino acids come together and they form that dipeptide, or this new protein that's being made. All right. Another one here we definitely have is anti, which means against. For example, antisepsis. Antisepsis means against infection. Okay, and more specifically in microbiology, an antiseptic means pertaining to against an infection. So therefore, an antiseptic, more specifically microbiology, pertains to a compound that inhibits or kills bacteria on living or animate surfaces like your skin. However, there is a different word, an opposing word, which is disinfectant. A disinfectant does the same thing. It kills or inhibits microbes. However, it kills or inhibits microbes on inanimate surfaces. For example, your tabletop, or the door handle, or the handle on the refrigerator, or the bottom of your shoe, or the goggles in the lab, or whatever. That would be disinfection. Okay, so that's a good thing you might want to know. Some food for thought there. Antiseptic is a chemical compound that kills or inhibits microbes on living or animate surfaces, versus a disinfectant, which kills or inhibits microbes on non-animate surfaces. For example, tabletops, a steel door handle, etc. Bi here means two. There are many different prefixes out there that mean two. For example, die also means two. It just depends on how it's used in the field. Brady here means slow. For example, we definitely have the word bradycardia. Oops, that's a Y. Bradycardia, which means a condition of having slower than normal heartbeat or heart rate. I like to think of Brady as, this might sound a little silly, but what helps me remember Brady is like the old TV show The Brady Bunch, when life was a little bit slower back then compared to today. I like to think of Brady Bunch. We also have here con. Con means with or together, often used in Latin languages. Spanish, con means with. Okay, there's a word here that applicable to that. For example, congenital anomaly. Okay, and congenital anomaly means irregular birth. Additional words that you might want to know. For example, prefixes. For example, contra. Contra means against or opposite. For example, contralateral. Contralateral, which means pertaining to the opposite side. D means down or lack of. We also have dia, which means through or complete. You remember diarrhea. Diarrhea means the complete discharge of feces or fecal matter. However, if you break down the word diarrhea, rhea means discharge, release of, discharge, and dia means complete. So if you were to slap definition the word diarrhea together, it just means complete discharge, but we have no clue the complete discharge of what. So therefore, one of those times when you can't use a slap definition to define the medical term. Definitely dialysis. We just talked about that moments ago. It is a separation of wastes from the blood, but once again, lysis means breakdown, destruction, or separation. Dia means complete or through. So therefore, if you were to do the SLAP definition of this, it would mean uh, the complete separation of. But we have no clue of what. So therefore, keep that in mind. It is the separation of waste from the blood. There are two types. There's natural dialysis from your kidneys, and there's artificial dialysis using a dialysis machine. Dys, right here. Dys means bad, painful, difficult, and abnormal. For example, dysplasia. Okay, dysplasia means condition of abnormal formation of cells. And I like to think of the word dys as, it's a slang that means to insult or to yeah, it just means to insult or say something bad to whatever. So I like to think of that. Or ecto, which means out or outside. For example, an ectopic pregnancy. Pregnancy. An ectopic pregnancy is a pregnancy that is out of place. For example, pregnancy, a fertilized zygote, or the fusion of a sperm and egg coming together. Okay, so when the egg cell and then we have here the sperm cell, they come together, they make this new ball of cells known as a zygote. Okay, now that zygote travels down and is supposed to implant itself into the female uterus, which is what it's again what it's supposed to do. But when it doesn't implant itself into the female uterus, or rather that it implants itself, say, in the fallopian tube, which is, I would believe, is tremendously painful. If a baby were to grow in the fallopian tube, that would be known as an ectopic pregnancy, outside of the normal place where it's supposed to happen. We also have here endo, which means in or within. For example, endotracheal. I'm going to go ahead and swing that on up here. Endotracheal right over there, which means pertaining to within the windpipe. All right. Epi means up, on, or above. We definitely have eu, which means good or normal. For example, euphoria. Whoops. Let's get a little eraser here, and let's kind of erase that. Euphoria here, which means good feeling or well-being. Ia actually means condition, so you can say condition of having good feelings or condition of well-being. Ex means out, outside, or away from. For example, exit, or well, this sounds pretty silly, but think of if a person were in a relationship and they're no longer in a relationship, the other person is known as their ex. Okay, away from, out, or outside of the relationship, considered your ex. But how about a medical term to go with this? How about exophthalmos? Exophthalmos. Exophthalmos means eyeballs that bulge outward. So if you look up on YouTube, you can see there's a Guinness World Record holder where a lady has this condition. Go on YouTube, look it up. A lady has a condition where if she puts a little bit of pressure on her eye, both her eyes bulge outward. I can't do it. I can't demonstrate for you, but you search on YouTube, eyes bulge outward. That would be exophthalmos. Hyper, which means here excessive or above. Think about a young child who is having too much sugar. That would be excessive, hyper, excessive or above. Or how about hyperglycemia? Oops, here, hyperglycemia. Hyperglycemia means an abnormal condition of having excessive blood sugar levels. Now keep this in mind. Now the most common definition that you're probably going to hear in the healthcare field is high blood sugar levels. However, in this class, in this lecture, I'm saying for you to remember as a condition, an abnormal condition of having excessive blood sugar, blood sugar. Okay, so it specifies, because when somebody eats, say, a piece of bread or a cake or a cookie, the sugar level is going to go up pretty high. It doesn't mean that it is abnormal. It doesn't mean that it is excessive. It just means that for that particular time after eating a meal, my blood sugar level is going to go up. So we want to be able to distinguish normal high blood sugar versus excessive high blood sugar. Or how about hypo? Hypo here means deficient or under. Again, we have hypoglycemia. Let's get the pen out here. Experiencing some difficulties here. Don't know what's going on, but we can definitely be talking about hypoglycemia. And hypoglycemia means an abnormal condition of having deficient blood sugar levels. Okay, not low. Most commonly, you're going to hear it out there as low blood sugar levels. I could be starving, could be hungry, I haven't had a meal all day. I would definitely have low blood sugar levels. However, it doesn't necessarily mean it's deficient. Okay, so just keep that in mind. Another one here, inter, which means between. For example, international, intercoastal, as we've discussed earlier. How about infra, which means beneath or under? For example, infracoastal. Infracoastal means pertaining to below the ribs or beneath the ribs. We also have here intra, which means in, within, or into. We've definitely have, let's go on to the next slide. We've got some other ones here. Mal. Mal here means bad, after the Spanish mal, which means very bad. For example, malaise. Okay, malaise here is a vague feeling of bodily discomfort. Okay, as you can see here, bodily discomfort is kind of not very good. It's pretty bad. So definitely meta means beyond or change. Definitely metamorphosis. If I can squeeze it in there. Metamorphosis means condition of change of shape or form. Many of you out there probably in 4th or 5th grade, or I think maybe 6th, 7th, or 8th grade, read the book Metamorphosis. So that's how I remember the word metamorphosis, that book that I remember reading way back in grade school. We also have here metastasis. Definitely, metastasis is the spread of a cancerous tumor to a secondary organ or tissue. There are two types of tumors out there. There's one that's a benign tumor, which is encased in a particular sac. It hasn't spread it yet, but as soon as the cancerous cells inside a benign tumor start to leak out and they start to spread out throughout the entire body and park themselves in another place, then that would be considered a cancerous tumor or a bad tumor. And the process when these cancerous cells move from one place to another, that is metastasis, or you might hear it metastasize out there in the clinical setting. Another one here that I would recommend, neo, which means new. For example, a neoplasm. A neoplasm here means new growth of a tumor in the blood. I'm sorry, just new growth of tumor. So I like to think of Neo as new. For example, if any of you have watched The Matrix, the movie The Matrix, the main character's name is Neo, and there's a symbolism to why his name is Neo, is because he represents a new time, or a new, or a renewal of the human race in the movie. So I would definitely want, maybe that will help you remember what Neo is. How about a pan? Pan here means all. For example, pancytopenia. Pancytopenia means deficiency of all blood cells. Earlier I said neoplasm means new growth of a tumor, and then I inserted the word blood. I didn't mean that. That was a misspoke right there. So please correct your notes there. So pancytopenia means deficiency of all blood cells. Now, if you look at this term, we don't see the word hemo, which means blood in there, but in medicine, we can assume that when you hear the word pancytopenia, is a deficiency of all blood cells. Or think about this word. You've probably heard for cameras or photographers out there, they like to take panoramic pictures. Panoramic means a complete a wide view, a 360 view of what they're looking at. So think about a panoramic view for photographers. We also have here para. Para here means abnormal, beside, or near. For example, paralysis. Paralysis means loss of movement in the muscle. Para is abnormal. Okay. I also like to think of Paranormal Activity, that movie. There's weird stuff going on in that movie. Lots of ghosts and lots of random things moving around the house and lots of those twitches. So think about Paranormal Activity or that movie out there. How about purr? Purr here means through, not to be confused with when the cat purrs. Okay, that's P-U-R-R. Purr here means through. We also have peri, which means surrounding. We definitely remember pericardium, which means a membrane structure surrounding the heart, or a membrane sac surrounding the heart, but not a structure surrounding the heart. That is too vague. But again, we use those roots, prefix, suffix definitions to derive the term, derive the definition for that word. Poly here means many or much. We definitely have here post, which means after or behind. Postpartum. Once again, just to kind of postpartum means pertaining to after a mother gives birth. Pro means before or forward. For example, prodrome. Prodrome here are signs and symptoms that appear before an illness. Let me switch my notes here. Re means back or again. For example, some of you, when listening to this lecture, might want me to repeat some of the slides. No problem. Go ahead and move that slider back a little bit so that I can repeat those again. Now, while I may be digitally repeating some slides for you, I'm probably out doing something else. I'm probably playing StarCraft, I'm probably at the beach, or I'm probably enjoying a warm cup of coffee in real life. But that's okay. Digitally, I can repeat these lectures as many times as you wish, and I won't feel bad about it whatsoever. So don't worry. Okay. So for example, here's a medical term, relapse. Relapse here is a disease or symptoms that returns after one has believed that it has been cured or removed. Also, remission. Remission here means signs or symptoms that lessen. We're going to skip a couple here. How about sub? Sub means under. I'd like to think of subcutaneous or like a submarine, but not to be confused with a subway. Same thing. It's when you have the train that goes underground. Not to be confused with the sandwich chain Subway, the restaurant chain Subway, fast food restaurant chain Subway. We also definitely have syn or sim, which means together or with, and there is a condition here known as syndactyly. We'll talk a little bit more about this later in the lecture. Syndactyly. Let's get my handy eraser out here because I totally messed up that word. Right now it is 2 o'clock in the morning when I'm doing this, so I'm doing the best I can. We have syndactyly, which is a condition of having webbed fingers or toes, and we'll talk about how this happens a little bit later, but there is a cellular process known as apoptosis. And in apoptosis, that's when cells are programmed to die, and during human development in the uterus, what happens here is that the fingers and toes start out as webbed fingers or webbed toes, and then through a genetic process, those fingers go through apoptosis and start to carve themselves out, giving us the digits that you have today for most individuals out there. But there are some out there where that process, some individuals out there where the process did not happen, and so therefore they retain the webs in their fingers and toes. Ducks versus chickens. Chickens definitely have apoptosis that carves out their digits, but ducks they don't. So therefore they maintain that webbed feet, which allows them to swim through the water. Tachy here, which means fast. If bradycardia means a condition of slower than normal heartbeat, then definitely tachycardia is the opposing to that. Tachycardia here is a condition of having rapid or a really fast heart rate or heartbeat. Trans here means across or through, and definitely uni means one. Okay, so hopefully some of those prefixes out there and some of the examples I've shown will help clarify or help you understand these prefixes a little bit more and some of those terms as well. Moving on a little bit, we're going to start talking a little bit about antigens versus antibodies. There's a little bit of microbiology here, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Now, on everyone's cells has a cell membrane. We already learned that in, I believe, chapter 2 lecture. If you don't remember that, go ahead and click on the link in the course and go back and review chapter 2. But every cell has a cell membrane, very much like their skin. And on the cell membrane, there are lots of these proteins or lots of these carbohydrates and glycolipids, glycoproteins, etc., etc. A lot of these molecules that are kind of sticking up everywhere. So if you look here on the slide, I'm going to go ahead and draw some for you. We definitely have here a cell, and on this cell there might be some sort of carbohydrate. I'm over exaggerating this image, or there might be a protein or something there. And a lot of times what these surface proteins or these surface macromolecules do is they act to serve as maybe an enzyme for the cell, or maybe as a recognition molecule, so that the cells, if cells in our entire body, can recognize each other and hold the integrity of that cell. Now, when a substance, so let's go ahead and talk about antigens first. An antigen is a substance that's usually foreign to the body that stimulates the production of antibodies. So on the surfaces of a lot of your cells, you have a lot of these proteins, or a lot of these macromolecules that act as recognition molecules so that they don't kill off each other. But sometimes a cell from the outside world, or a bacteria cell, or a virus in this case, comes into your system, and obviously a lot of your white blood cells or your soldier cells, they don't have eyes like we do to see what's out there, and how they are able to touch and recognize what cells are there is by reading these cell receptors, or trying to see recognize those cell receptors. Now, any cell receptor or any cell membrane macromolecule that the body does not recognize, your white blood cell comes into contact, say, if you look on the slide here, this virus, and on this virus we've got tons of these antigens on there, okay? And if the body touches this virus and says, wait a minute, we're not supposed to have these molecules on these cells, it's going to flag that particular entity, in this case is a virus, and these antibodies, white blood cells, produce these antibodies, which are protein substances made by your white blood cells in response to the presence of foreign antigens. So your white blood cells go out there and they say, shoot, you're not supposed to be there, let's make these antibodies. I'd like to think of antibodies as soldier molecules. They get shot out from these white blood cells. Here's an example of an antibody. get shot out and they start to attach to these antigens and kind of like flagging them, kind of toss a little mark, the mark of death, I like to call it. Antibodies are like the mark of death for these molecules. As soon as that antibody hits and connects with these antigens, for example, on this virus, then other white blood cells, many different kinds, other white blood cells are going to come in and start to tear that virus apart. Now, are all viruses prone to white blood cells? Sure, absolutely. But do they all get tagged by white blood cells? Absolutely not. One of the most common viruses that is very difficult for white blood cells to tag, of course, is a human immunodeficiency virus, or HIV. So once again, an antigen is a substance usually foreign to the body that stimulates production of antibodies. Now, for example, we definitely have poisons. The flu virus or bacterium can be examples of those antigens. But keep this in mind, though. Your blood cells, okay, in the healthcare field, blood type A, blood type B, AB, etc. Those are different molecules that are macromolecules found on the surfaces of red blood cells. Now, when a person with blood type B gets infused with blood that is blood type A, that causes an immune response, because the person's body, blood type B, is going to reject blood type A. So the blood type A is considered an antigen for the blood type B person. But if a blood type A gets injected into another person that is also blood type A, no immune response. So therefore, technically, per the definition, it is not considered an antigen because it did not cause the production of antibodies in this particular person. However, for all intensive purposes, blood types A, B, and etc. are considered to be antigenic because they can produce an immune response. They can stimulate the production of antibodies in various cases for other people out there. So in the medical field, they just lump sum them all in one, just call them all antigens and be done with it. So just keep that in mind as you are studying this further. Now, in addition, so earlier, we're going to talk more about this in another chapter, but there are two different kinds of blood recognition proteins out there, one of which is definitely A and another one is B. So an individual can be blood type A, or they can also be blood type B. Or they can be both blood type AB, or they can have not a single one of those two, which is blood type O. We'll talk more about those in a later chapter, of course. But there's one more factor that is considered in here, and that would be known as the Rh factor, which is an antigen antibody condition that develops when there is a difference in Rh blood factor between that of the mother and that of the fetus. So a lot of times you might see on a blood type card A positive or B negative, etc., etc. This positive here and that negative determines whether or not the person has the Rh factor on their blood cells. So just keep that in mind as a future lecture comes up when we start talking about blood cells. So let's go ahead and get started. And why is this Rh condition very important or relevant for us? Now, once again, if an individual does not have the Rh factor, there is nothing on their cell, so this would be considered an Rh negative. But if they definitely do have that Rh protein or that Rh factor on their cell membrane, then they're definitely considered Rh positive. Something can happen when a baby, this is genetics, when a baby happens to have the Rh factor on his or her cells, but the mother does not. So if the mother does not have the Rh factor on it, the mother again is going to start to produce antibodies against the baby that has the Rh factor. That's quite unfortunate, and a lot of you out there in the digital world studying this chapter are probably wondering, why would the mother's body want to develop antibodies to fight against her own developing baby? Well, I have some news for you. Okay, when it comes to cells, the cells don't have a conscious like we do where we can tell this is our child. The cells only know what's on the surface of those cells. And if there's something on the surface of that cell that is not compatible with the mother's body, then forget that. That body is going to start to reject that particular entity, even if it means rejecting the baby. So let's go ahead and take a look here at the first pregnancy. Of course, the baby has the Rh antigen on his or her red blood cells, and the mother does not. And in this lucky case, the baby is not affected because the mother has yet to develop recognition for that particular antigen. Now, I'm not going to say that the mother's body is not going to produce not going to send the white blood cells out there, but what's going to happen is that when the mother's body does send the white blood cells out there, the white blood cells are going to start to try and find a way to recognize that Rh factor, and so that the next time that the body comes across it, then the body will know what to do. It's like developing an immunity against the Rh factor cells. Okay, but in this lucky case, the first pregnancy, the baby is lucky to make it out because the mother has yet to become sensitized or even recognize that Rh factor. It's not until the second pregnancy that it becomes a big problem because at this time, the mother has some experience handling an entity in her body that does have that Rh factor. So when the second pregnancy comes along, the white blood cells are going, you know what? I recognize this. This is something I've dealt with before, but since you're back here, I'm going to study you a little bit more and start sending out those antibodies. And unfortunately, in this case, the second baby will develop a hemolytic disease which destroys a lot of the red blood cells, which is known as HDN, hemolytic disease. Of the newborn, and a lot of the symptoms, one of the symptoms that results from that is known as jaundice, and it results in a lot of orange color in the skin of this baby. Now, one of the ways in which one can prevent the Rh factor prevent the antibodies from interacting here is to prescribe an immune globulin injectant in the mother within 72 hours of delivery, miscarriage, or abortion of an Rh fetus. And you're probably asking me, why within 72 hours? Here's the reason why. Because the baby in the uterus, there is a barrier between the placenta and that of the baby. The only thing that crosses through are the nutrients and the oxygen that the mother is going to provide for the baby. However, within 72 hours of the baby giving birth, there are little micro tears in the placenta because obviously the mother is preparing to give birth to the baby. So there's a lot of force and a lot of action going on there, and so therefore some of the mother's blood might leak through into the placenta, and therefore white blood cells are going to come along with it and start to fight off that particular entity. So by prescribing an immunoglobulin injection into the Rh mother within 72 hours, what ends up happening is one of two things. It depends on the particular immunoglobulin. One is that the baby, which has this is the Rh factor on his or her cells, what's going to happen is that the immunoglobulin, I'm going to change the color of my pen so it's easier for the eyes here. The immunoglobulin is going to come in here and plug up. I'm just going to call it IMMG for immunoglobulin. The immunoglobulin is going to go in there and plug up that Rh factor so that if the mother's antibody comes along, it's unable to connect with the baby's cells and therefore allows a baby to survive. That's one way. Another way here, rather than plugging up the baby's Rh factor, plug up the mother's immune antibodies. Plug those up so that it cannot connect with the baby's Rh factor. And a lot of times these immunoglobulins that are designed to synthesize synthetically, of course, in the lab, they disintegrate and degrade after a certain amount of time. Okay, so an excellent way in which we can protect the baby. A congenital anomaly here is an irregularity in a structure or organ that an infant is born with. So congenital anomaly is infant is born with it. Okay, one of the conditions here of one of the examples of a condition that is a congenital anomaly would be syndactyly. I told you guys I would talk about it a little bit. Again, that is when an individual has webbed fingers or toes. Heart defects as well, and club feet is also included in a congenital anomaly as well. Now, some of these congenital anomalies are hereditary, these are genetic. Others are produced by factors that are present during pregnancy. For example, when a pregnant mother here drinks way too much alcohol, definitely way too much alcohol during pregnancy will cause a lot of defects in the developing embryo, the developing baby, which is why a lot of healthcare professionals out there strongly urge a lot of the mothers to not drink or take in anything that is carcinogenic, okay, pertaining to producing a cancerous condition or cancer. Okay, so avoid the alcohol out there. Actually, everyone should avoid alcohol altogether, but of course, I'm pretty sure everyone has their opinions about that. But it doesn't hurt to recommend good stuff for everyone out there. There was a pattern of physical and mental defects in the infant at birth. So a lot of babies that are born from mothers who are chronic alcoholics tend to have a lot of birth defects there. So. Now, this is one of those topics here that I'm not quite so sure as to why it's being discussed in the textbook, but I'll go ahead and talk about it anyway, since it is one of the areas that I am very familiar with. One of which here is known as recombinant DNA. If only I could find my mouse there. There we go. Recombinant DNA is when you take a gene from one organism. So, for example, let's say that I have a particular gene here for insulin. Okay, that would be an example of a gene of insulin. And then what happens is that we take out that genetic code for insulin. Take it out. So now we have here the code for insulin. I'm just going to abbreviate that as the letter I. And then we're going to stick it in something else. For example, we have here something known as a plasmid, the letter I there. So now we've taken the genetic code to make insulin and stuck it into another block of DNA, another chromosome, and then stick that whole chromosome inside, say, a yeast cell. Stick that in here, where we can brew these in a tub and start to synthetically produce, not synthetically, but start to artificially produce yeast using another organism's DNA replication machinery. So this is quite a very interesting topic here, because long ago, before the invent of recombinant DNA technology, people who were diabetic had to rely on cadavers or dead individuals, where the scientists and the healthcare professionals go in, extract the blood and spin it, centrifuge it, and pull out insulin from them, and then sell it out there for like pretty much a really high price. But with the invent of recombinant DNA, we're able to just take that code, stick it into another block of another chromosome, or a plasmid in this example. I won't get into too much detail. You can take a majors biology class. I also teach that class, and if you want to take it, you can look me up. And then take that particular plasmid that contains that genetic code for insulin and stick it in another organism and make a lot of copies of it. It's for cheap, it's very inexpensive, definitely reduces the cost out there for a lot of patients, and not too many people are complaining about the use of yeast in there's pretty much a genetically modified organism, a GMO, because yeast naturally doesn't have insulin. But if we're going to stick an insulin gene in there, it's going to be considered a GMO. But not too many people are going to complain about that. Okay, we also have here polymerase chain reaction, also known as PCR. If there is a particular, say, we discover the gene for anti-aging. Okay, we discover that particular gene in another plant or another organism, and we want to use it for ourselves, for example. So a scientist would take out that particular gene when they've discovered it, and make multiple copies of that particular gene. And one of the methods to do that is known as polymerase chain reaction, which is an artificial way to make multiple copies of a particular gene, of a single gene. And it's much cheaper. It it is quite a process to do, but at least it's much better than sitting there and waiting for the cells to naturally produce multiple copies of that gene. So it allows us to make multiple backups of whatever we want. A syndrome. A syndrome here is a group of signs or symptoms that commonly occur together and indicates a particular disease or abnormal condition. We definitely have an example of a syndrome here known as Ray's syndrome, which is characterized by vomiting, swelling of the brain, increased intracranial pressure in the brain, hypoglycemia, and dysfunction of the liver. And this, unfortunately, can occur in children after a viral infection, and that has been treated with aspirin. So, quite unfortunate there. Okay, we have here transurethral resection of the prostate. I would definitely want to know this. This is TURP right over here. We'll I believe we probably talked about this in another chapter, but pretty much it is when a portion of the prostate gland is removed with an instrument that passes through the urethra. You have a hot wire at the end of this instrument, goes into the male urethra. This is for men, into the male urethra, and then that hot wire goes in and then starts to carve out the inflamed prostate in order to allow for the free passage of urine through the urethra and out. Okay, this is tremendously painful, and one of the ways to relieve an inflammation of the prostate or prostate there, and pretty much remove the inflamed prostate or portions of it. Now, this procedure is indicated when prostatic tissue increases. Of course, we have here hyperplasia. We've talked about these terms earlier, and it interferes with urination. Now here we have a ultrasonography, which is a diagnostic technique using ultrasound waves to produce an image or photograph of an organ. Just to keep in mind here, light and sound are emitted in the form of a wave. As you can see that I'm drawing there on the image, they're emitted in the form of a wave. Each sound, each color of light has a different wavelength, and we'll talk more about this in the radiology chapter, nuclear medicine. They have a different wavelength, longer or shorter. Okay, and that here's another one there that will determine the characteristic of that wave. And we can definitely use ultrasonography, which has really short wavelengths, in order to produce this image. The author of our textbook here provided us here with an ultrasonography of her young baby girl, so that's quite interesting there. An echocardiogram does the same thing. It uses ultrasound in order to get an image of the heart. And think about echo here like a bat. A bat uses echolocation, sends up very sharp sound waves out there because they can't see at night. And then once the sound waves bounces off a surface, it comes back and they receive it in their audio receptors, in their ears or their whatever their receptors are to map out the surroundings. And we definitely here have a sonogram, which again gives us a fetal ultrasound image as well. All right, so I hope that you found this lecture informative. I hope that you've learned something from it. The lectures are going to get more dense. I'm telling you, this is the last chapter to go in terms of memorizing roots, prefixes, and suffixes. Again, I expect everyone to study really hard for chapters 1, 2, 3, and 4 if you haven't done so already, because once chapter 5 hits, we start with the digestive system, and then onward down there, we're going to definitely start talking about basic human anatomy and physiology. We're going to talk about the pathology. We're going to talk about some of the clinical procedures, and we're going to start to shift our focus more toward applying what we know about medical terminology to these basic, this basic medical knowledge here. So I hope that you're ready for that, because this is where what distinguishes this is what makes or breaks pretty much whether or not a student is going to be proficient and a master of medical terminology, or just going to be another student just memorizing words out of a book. So hopefully through my lectures and through your investment and my investment in this lecture and your investment in your studying, you can not only know the medical term, but you'll definitely know how to use it. You'll definitely know how to apply it, and you'll even get some basic human anatomy and physiology and out of that too. So I hope you're ready for that. I'm ready for it. I hope you are. I'll see you in the next lecture, and definitely study hard for chapters 1, 2, 3, and 4. Those roots, prefixes, suffixes, combining forms. Definitely study hard. See you next time. I'm checking out.